lecture on a very pertinent topic. We are happy to have you here with us, and we trust that those persons in our virtual audience and those persons here would be enlightened on a topic that is not only relevant in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but a topic that is relevant all across the globe. Before we go any further into tonight's proceedings, I am going to ask Pastor Dr. Cecil Richards to please come and bless our proceedings, and I invite everyone to please stand at this time.
I'm always happy to do this, to acknowledge the presence of God. I mean, it is not just a formality as far as I am concerned. It is an awareness and an acknowledgement that God is sovereign and that He is powerful and that we are subject to His grace and His mercy. Let us bow before our Almighty God. And so, Heavenly Father, we give this evening's proceedings over to you, Father. Father, we thank you that you have given us life. You have given us through your grace eternal life through your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, we thank you that you give other gifts and the wisdom to assess and the matter at hand, our economy and inflation and the impact, oh God. Father, we thank you that through the changing scenes of life, you have been good to us. And Father, even in times when the prices have been astronomical, you have provided. And Father, even when there was nothing, you have still provided, God. We thank you. Father, we acknowledge you as our great benefactor tonight. Now, God, Father, we come tonight to ask that you will give wisdom to the presenter. Father, that he would present with precision. And that, Father, that the thoughts that are shared in this room would be impacting and not remain here, Father, that we will take these as seeds that will benefit our country. Father, we also ask that with the approaching weather system, Father, that we be kept safe as we look to you, O God, our protector. We ask your blessing now through Christ, your Son. Amen.
Thank you so much, Pastor Richards. Please don't sit as yet. We are in a public lecture series, and this is to help to enlighten and boost the human capital of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we pledge our loyalty and devotion to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So at this time, we are now going to sing lustily together the national anthem of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. St. Vincent, land so beautiful, with joyful hearts we pledge to thee our loyalty and love, and vow to keep you ever free. Whatever future brings, our faith will see us through. May peace reign from shore to shore. Irene of air, your mountains high, so clear and green, are home to me, though I may stray. Come serene, whatever future brings, our faith will see us through. May peace reign from shore to shore. Our little sister, lands are those gems, the lovely Grenadines upon their seas. Golden suns, the ever beams. Whatever future brings, our faith will see us through. May peace reign from shore to shore. Thank you so much. You did so very well. Please be seated. Tonight, I know the fact that many of you are here show that there is an interest in the topic of inflation. And I had a brief conversation with a young lady inviting her to the lecture. I must say that the audience so far has been dominated by men, which is not the usual case. So I must mention that tonight we have our males out. Congratulations, males. But on the topic of inflation, when I engaged someone to ask them about whether or not they understood exactly what is taking place in the global arena, they did not express much knowledge. And I think it is most fitting for us to start tonight by having a basic understanding of the topic. What is inflation? And, you know, to make sure that the average person can understand, it is that general increase in prices and the fall in purchasing power. So you may be well familiar, and I know Pastor Dr. Cecil Richards is well familiar with the local calypso, bread and butter, or soca song. And I know that several of us are seeing rising prices in one form or another. And these inflationary effects that we are witnessing, becomes part of a national discourse, a discussion that is happening also in the global arena. Tonight we have two economists who are going to share on, or two learned individuals who will share on the topic. And to start us off, we're going to have Professor Justin Robinson, who is a Vincentian son of the soil, and he has served as Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Cave campus. He also lectures for the Department of Management Studies in the arena of financial management. And I know Professor Robinson may not remember me, but I was one of his financial management students. And he said I survived. Professor Robinson obtained his PhD in finance from the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He also holds a Master's of Science degree in Finance and Econometrics from Florida International University and a Bachelor's of Science degree in Management Studies with first-class honors from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. He specializes in the following areas: capital markets in developing countries, public finance, financial risk management, and corporate finance. Professor Justin Robinson was recently the recipient of the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Public Service and Service to the University, and I believe that we could give him a round of applause. With regard to public service, Professor Robinson currently serves as the director of the Central Bank of Barbados, a director of the Barbados Independent Film Festival, the vice president of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and as a member of the Ratings Committee for the Caribbean Information and Credit Rating Services Limited. He was formerly the chairman of the National Insurance Scheme, Barbados. At the University of the West Indies, Professor Robinson served as Dean, Faculty, Social Sciences, Interim Director for the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management. He is also a member of the University Council and chair of the Campus Bookshop Management Committee. He has authored and co-authored several publications, and I would not try to list exhaustively what those publications are, but just to share a few. How does news impact on the stock prices of green firms in emerging markets? Semi-strong firm market efficiency in stock markets with low levels of trading activity. Evidence from the stock price reaction to major national and international events. Parliamentary elections and frontier stock markets, evidence from stock market research, to reaction to general elections in the Commonwealth Caribbean. He has also authored Financial Deepening and Economic Growth in Jamaica. as well as market efficiency, sovereign debt restructuring, and credit ratings in developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Professor Justin Robinson to share on tonight's topic, inflation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Welcome, Professor Robinson.
Okay, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. The welcome isn't always that warm. I have vivid memories of being invited to give a lecture in the Midlands in the UK, and I got there a bit early, and the treasurer was wrapping up his report, and he said that they had turned the organization around and they were making a lot of money, and they were making so much money that next year they were able to afford better speakers. So I'm really grateful for that very warm welcome. Nice to be home, a lot of familiar faces in the audience. So I want to start by congratulating Luke for organizing this event, and he is the main event, so I'm really the opening act to sort of lay the wicket for him. But I think it's quite important as we try to develop and build out the public space in St. Vincent. I mean, we have newspapers, we have a lot of calling programs and so on. But I think events like this add a new dimension to the public space, and I think it's important that we continue to push that. I think the community college has an important role to play in maybe adding some structure to these kinds of events. I mean, in my new role at UE, I spend a lot of time with community colleges, and we have there are a lot of good community colleges around the region, and ours is right up there with the best of them. So again, so I see a really big role. Okay, so I'm going to speak briefly and try to give a little bit of a history and a context. So, and really in three parts. Maybe give a brief history of inflation, hyperinflation, and inflation in St. Vincent, to lay that background. Part two, some cost of living issues in 2022, and we would have done a brief survey. I would have done a survey and we would report on that. And part three, some policy responses, how might policymakers respond. I think I'm just going to do one slide on that initially, and then after Luke does his thing, we can come back. So maybe we start first with some definitions. I hope that's what you're seeing on your screen there. So I have 4 definitions there. So inflation, and I think the chair lady did an excellent job. So, inflation really a quantitative measure of the rate at which purchasing power declines as reflected by an increase in the average price of a basket of goods and services in the economy. So essentially, periodically, you do some surveys, you take a selected basket of goods and you measure what does it cost to buy that basket of goods. You convert that into an index, and the inflation rate is really the percentage change in that index. So at some point, index might have started at 100. That's often a random number that statisticians use. So you start at point 0, point 1, you redo the survey. When you look at the prices, if they've gone up by 5% on average, then the index would be at 105. It's a 5% increase, and that's what is often reported. The 2 most popular ways of doing that are what we call the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and that's what is commonly reported, and people literally go around to supermarkets and different places and collect the prices of goods that they think are a typical consumption basket for Vincentians, and collect those prices and then compute that index. An alternative is like a producer price index, because sometimes that gives you an earlier warning about coming inflation. When you look at the prices because in a sense, consumer price index measures the final price, what you pay when you go to the supermarket. Producer price index, you collect the information from the actual vendors or the suppliers, so you might get that early. So we don't have that reported here. So again, I think these are the kinds of projects that you can get some people, particularly through the college, that you can collect that data and report it, because that's sometimes more of an early indicator than the consumer price index. So inflation really is a normal part of life. I mean, the other two things on the slide there are really the nasty things, where things get really problematic, where you have hyperinflation, which is where the inflation rate is above 50% annually. And so even though we are struggling and crying under the prices, we are nowhere in the zone of a hyperinflation. And then stagflation. Stagflation is also especially problematic because inflation tends to be associated with a growing economy. In some ways, the old definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, so sometimes the economy is heating up and growing too fast. Stagflation is when you have an economy that's not growing, but you also have inflation, and we would have experienced some of that in the 1970s. So just to give you some examples, I think I have the 5 worst hyperinflation episodes in history. So the worst we have on record is Hungary in 1946, where the inflation rate was 207% per day. So that's like you buy a roti today for $10 and you come back tomorrow and that roti price has gone up by 200%. And they actually, because prices were rising so fast, they actually printed what is called a 100 quintillion note. Now, my arithmetic is not good enough to know what a quintillion is, but that's quite large. The second worst episode was Zimbabwe in 2008. It was 98, where the inflation rate was 98% per day in 2008. And again, they were printing, the highest note they printed to deal with that was a $100 trillion note. So I'm sort of thinking of that like you walking through town and a man begging you and he's asking you for $1 million, because that's really the context that you are operating in there. Yugoslavia, 1993, again a 64% daily inflation rate. And their biggest note was a $500 billion note. Closer to home and much more recent, we had Venezuela in 2017, which really had a nasty dose of hyperinflation. So in 2017, their inflation rate was 14,200% for the year. Okay, prices increased by 14,000% in the year 2017. What the graph shows is how much time it would take for a dollar, a Venezuelan bolivar, to lose 90% of its value. So you go to buy something today and it gives you 100 and it costs you 100, but that same $100 can only buy 90%. And in Venezuela, in that period, that happened every 5 months. A bolivar lost 90% of its value every 5 months. So that must be an interesting environment. And the fifth one, Germany in the 1930s. This was in many ways what led Hitler into office. And paper notes were so useless that people cut them up. They cut them up and used them for wallpaper. Okay. And I know a famous joke from that period was about 2 brothers. One brother was very frugal and saved all his money, and the other brother used to drink, and he was so filthy, he kept all his empty wine bottles. But in the height of the inflation, those wine bottles were worth significantly more than the cash his frugal brother had saved. Okay, so I think it's useful to have that context that we are not in hyperinflation zone yet. It's a painful inflation episode, but we are way outside the zone of having an annual inflation rate of 50%. So I now turn to look at some data in terms of inflation for St.Vincent. I have a data set looking at inflation from 1975. So if we look at from 1975 to 2022, The average rate of inflation has been relatively low. 3.89% is the average. The median rate is 2.65%. The highest rate we experienced ever was 17.21%, and we will see that on the next slide. So 17.21 was our highest rate ever achieved in a single year. And we actually had a year, hard to believe, where prices actually fell, where there was a negative 1.73%. Next slide, please. Is that slide too busy? Can you all see that well? Because I have another slide that tries to capture the same thing. But is that a little too busy? Sorry? So you all can see it clearly? Okay, so what you see there is a fairly nasty period of relatively high inflation from about 1976. So in 1976, the inflation rate was 11.3%, 1977, 10%, 1978, 8%, 1980, 15%, and 1981 was that 17.2%. Fitz, I think we were too young and playing football. We were not paying any bills, so we were blissfully ignorant to this insurance, but to this inflation. But that certainly was a very nasty period, because the 81, 12.74%. So certainly for that period of time between 1976 and 1981, we really had a 5-year period where there was quite high inflation in St. Vincent. We then went into it then went down, and we had very stable, relatively low rates of inflation, quite within what you would expect. A spike in 1990 when it was up to 7.61%. Again, if we go back to the 76 period, and it's a very interesting period because it's the immediate period around the oil crisis. So again, it's a similar, so you have a global, so that's actually the formation of OPEC. We see oil prices spike, but it does seem to linger in St. Vincent a lot longer than other places where I have looked at the data, where it takes us really a 5-year period to almost work through that. And then you have very low, relatively modest inflation, spike in 2007, back up to 7.2%, then a rise in 2008 to 10.07%. And maybe one of the reasons why we are reacting this way to this spike in inflation is that we have gone through almost a 13-year period of relatively low inflation. Because if you see on the graph there, after that spike in 2008, inflation has been really quite modest. And the data I'm picking up 2022 so far, a rate of about 6.07%. So after a really long period of relatively benign inflation, we're getting hit there again. So I think you can probably skip the next one because I kind of talked that through. Now, what drives inflation in St. Vincent? It certainly seems to be what people call import cost push inflation. A lot of it is externally driven. So if you look there, we do see that inflation in St. Vincent really tracks or follows U.S. inflation quite closely. Those two lines I think make very good dancing partners. They're really moving very, very well together. Although again, we do see that odd period there in 1980 where inflation in St. Vincent really overshoots the U.S. inflation by a significant amount and seems to come down rather slowly. Again, we have that overshooting in 1988 and again in 2008. And that looks like something that somebody could get a PhD for. That certainly is an interesting anomaly as to why you would have overshooting, because even the current spike is in line. All right, next slide. Okay, so in terms of the current inflationary spiral, the external cause, as we all know really, is that Russian-Ukraine war, which has led to a spike in the price of oil in 2022 natural gas, which doesn't affect us that much. But corn, wheat, again, we see a significant spike there in 2022, and in the price of metals. And I don't know about you guys, but I always thought of myself as a relatively informed person in touch. But who knew that Ukraine was such a major supplier of stuff that would affect us directly? I certainly didn't have a clue. And I guess Luke will speak a little bit more about that in his bit. So what I now want to turn to is to report to you briefly the results of our survey on how Vincentians feel about this particular spike in the cost of living. So we got 534 people responding. The survey was run between June 12th and June 28th. There is some bias in the sample. A couple of, which constituency am I in, Luke? Which one am I? East Kingston. Is East Kingston one that has one of the, yes, so that has one of the higher response rates. Maybe because I sent it to both Luke and Fitz, so yeah. We have West St. George. Let me see South Leeward. How does South Leeward do? Because let me see if my sister and others did their job well. Okay, so how concerned are people about the cost of living? And they are quite concerned, where you have 78% of the respondents saying that they are very concerned. 14%, 14.5% are quite concerned, so that's a significant chunk of the population. So it's clearly something that is top of mind. There are a few people, there's a 0.6% who are not concerned at all, so it's okay. Good luck to them. Okay, again, which areas are people feeling, which, if any, rises in the cost of living are you experiencing? Household electricity costs, so that's 86% seeing a spike on that. 67% with gas and diesel. Only 12.3% in rent, so housing isn't affected as one might expect. And obviously the biggest area, groceries and food, up 95%. And worryingly, medicines and healthcare also up 50%. We certainly don't want people not complying. Next question is one that surprised me, because actually we were actually commissioned to do, we did this exact survey in Barbados, and this response really surprised me, that, and the results are quite similar, where has your mental health been negatively affected by the rising cost of living? And 56% of people say yes, so I didn't anticipate that inflation would be driving people crazy, but it's certainly, okay, but that's a significant, that's a decent chunk, and maybe they're interpreting that question. I'm wondering how they're interpreting that question. Now, it's certainly interesting, and I think one of the things you might speculate on is why people are complaining or feeling it so much, and it might be a shift in that same basket of goods we are talking about. So maybe if now we have more Vincentians who drive, or car ownership has gone up. So in the olden days, they used to say in politics that you really had to have, to keep the population quiet, you had to have bread and circuses. You had to provide them bread and entertainment, and I sense that gasoline is the new bread. And so we look at the cost of filling up your vehicle the last time, and 44% are saying they're paying between $101 to $150. 32.6% are paying over $150. The others are quite low. I don't know how these compare to normal prices in Barbados, but these are still low compared to Barbados. Yeah, it's quite low. I have a friend who filled up his BMW Jeep last week, and he was paying something like $400 and plus. So it is quite expensive. And I don't buy gas, so I feel like an aristocrat with this, right? Because I drive an electric vehicle, so I haven't been to the gas station. So. What was the amount of your most recent electricity bill? So 1.33% are doing between $0 to $50. 5.87% are doing between 51 to 100. 13.8 are paying between 101 to 150. And 25% are paying 151 to 200. So again, I don't know how those compare normally, but those are still quite low compared to Barbados. My light bill last month was in excess of $600 Barbados dollars. Okay, worrying question, have you had to cut back on food and any essentials? And we have 82% of persons saying they've had to cut back on food and essentials. So certainly that's biting into the basic living. And approximately how much more are you spending each month compared to this time last year? And we have the vast majority spending about 150. Well, we have 10%, 151 to 200 more a month, and 76% of persons are saying over $200 a month. So it's certainly beginning to bite. And as I wrap up here, and I want to come back after to discuss maybe the policy. So how have governments around the world been responding to this cost of living increase among their population? And we had a recent survey, well, not a survey, a recent summary done by the IMF looking at 134 countries and how governments have responded. So the most dominant response by governments has been a reduction in consumption taxes. So even though we import most of the inflation, there is an element that the government does control. The goods land at a certain price, and then the price you pay is rarely government impositions, usually import, excise tax, there may be a value-added tax plus the margin. So governments do have some influence over that, and so there's been some reduction. Because by the very nature of the arithmetic, governments will get a windfall in tax revenue from inflation. Because if you are applying a 20% excise tax to an imported good, if that good used to land at $100, when you apply the 20% to it, you would collect 20. If the good now comes at $200 and you apply 20%, so almost by definition, government will get some element of windfall. Exactly how much can be questionable because the government does exist in the same economy. It has to buy goods and services and so on. But governments, in a sense, governments have decided, well, how much of the windfall I'm going to share to provide an ease to my population. And the most dominant has been a reduction in consumption taxes. Sometimes there's been a price freeze and a price subsidy. So they say, okay, the price can't go above this. Or the government allows the price to go, but then they give persons a subsidy. Reductions in income taxes and other measures. Subsidies to specific industries. Reductions in custom duties. Vouchers and utility bills discounts has been another popular response. Cash transfers, trade restrictions, and others. And I guess before I give way to Luke, my view on that is in terms of policy response. So I think the first principle is do no harm to the public finances. I think that's the first job of the Minister of Finance, to do no harm to the public finances. You have a certain trajectory that you have the public finances on, but within the scope of what the public, that does not damage the public finances, I tend to favor targeted responses. You identify the most vulnerable groups and you target your responses to that group. So, but I think we need flexible an agile policy, which is really focused primarily on protecting the most vulnerable. So, and of course, next slide, please. And of course, you know, you live in St. Vincent, you can always go to the Grenadines or one of these things and forget about the cost of living. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Robinson. For a moment, I thought I was back at UE there, taking in a good lecture. I like particularly your call to action to the students of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College and the lecturers and undoubtedly the leaders within that institution to become more active in collecting data that is pertinent to these topics of relevance. And I also loved your reassurance that we're not in the worst case scenarios. So thank you very much for your presentation. At this time, I have the honor to introduce my brother. I don't get this distinct honor very often. I know that he is a public figure in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and quite a few persons, or maybe more than a few, would know quite a bit about him. He is an economist, a statistician, a mathematician, a politician, and soon to be an attorney at law as well, right here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. For many years now, he has been involved in public education. I think it is a passion of his, and I commend his passion in this area. In 2008, he commenced his lecture series in the group 2x2, and I see Kimsha here. Kimsha was a part of that lecture series. He then continued on with the O.C. Ford Memorial Lecture Series and became engrossed, or he immersed himself in the Entrepreneurs of SVG project, where he highlighted some stories of prominent entrepreneurs in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I'm sure many of you would have that book on your shelves in your homes, and you, if like me, I have gained tremendous insight from the persons he wrote about then. Tonight he is continuing his public education on topics of relevance, and inflation is one such topic. I am thankful to him, I commend his effort, and I would ask him to now come and speak on this topic. Let's welcome Luke.
Thank you, Tamira, and it's not very often that I have the opportunity to have been introduced by my sister, and the good thing about being introduced by your sister is that you don't find yourself in a scenario like Professor Robinson found himself in. You know, otherwise you are able to take it up at home. When Tamira introduced Professor Robinson earlier as well, she made reference to all his professional accomplishments and accolades and the trajectory of his career. One of the things which she omitted to mention was when he was fresh out of the St. Vincent Grammar School, he teamed up with a gentleman by the name, who's now known as Pastor Dr. Cecil Richards, and they were teachers together at the St. Martin's Secondary School, and you could only imagine what stories they exchanged when they had an opportunity to have a conversation before the start of this event. I'm happy to see so many of you here today. It shows a great commitment to this activity and the fact that you want to be a part of the process of public education in this country on what I consider to be a very important topic. I know that Professor Robinson was very kind in his remarks by describing me as the main event tonight. But I know that I defer on this occasion to his towering credentials, because he has certainly been laboring in the vineyard of economics and econometrics for a very long time. And I think that we just had a real treat from him by sharing the insights on inflation in general and some specific concerns with respect to inflation in this era in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'd just like you to show him some appreciation. And we recognize as well that in as much as he is a Vincentian, he is out of his usual habitat. because he takes up residence he is taking up residence in Barbados. He's not even driving the kinds of vehicles we drive. I don't know if he's making some recommendations for policy, because he has said in Barbados there's no duty on electric cars. I don't know if we've evolved to that position in St. Vincent and the Grenadines just yet, but certainly if we are to express forcefully our commitment to climate, to addressing climate change and achieving our green energy targets, it might be something that is considered by the government sooner rather than later. I have a prepared text and I'd go through it. The world is currently going through a period of high inflation, and I thought it was necessary for me to make a contribution to public education on this subject. I was influenced by the fact that inflation has become one of the most popular talking points across the globe, and also one of the most pressing political issues of these times. This is reflected in the lyrics of the Carnival hit song, Hard Times, that was written by an artist called Carbon Jams, as presented below. Everything gone up. I can't sing it. I'll just talk it. Everything gone up. Sugar gone up, light gone up, chow mein gone up, rum gone up, gas gone up, milk gone up, wife gone up, Pampers gone up, tax gone up, KFC gone up, weave gone up. I mean, everything. This song also alludes to the stranglehold of debt and says in a popular refrain that all we can do in Vinci is eat bread and butter. This song reminded me of the poem Dirty Tough that was written by Jamaica's Louise Bennett at an earlier juncture of Caribbean history, which contains the following words: sun a shine, but things no bright. Hard time a beat we. Them might raise we wages, but £1 gone on pon we pay, and we feel no merriment. For £10 gone pon we food, and £10 pon we rent. Saltfish gone up, mackerel gone up, pork and beef gone up, and when rice and butter ready, them just go pon holiday. Cloth, boot, pin and needle gone up, ice bread, taxes, water rate, kerosene, oil, gasoline gone up, and the pound devaluate. The price of bread gone up so high that we have to agree, fi cut we pon bread and all, turn dumpling refugee. In the course of this presentation, I'd give you a sense of the global nature of the inflation problem by reference to relevant figures for the United Kingdom and the United States of America. Subsequently, I will provide regional information on rising prices in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then focus on the situation right here at home in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I will make the point that inflation tends to have a disproportionate effect on the poor. In fact, there's a saying that it is expensive to be poor. We will discuss the causes of inflation, comment on the government's response to it, and draw conclusions. In the United Kingdom, the rate of inflation is at its highest point in 4 decades. It hit 5.4% in December 2021 and rose even higher to 7% as at the start of spring, which is to say the 20th of March 2022. And I saw recent newspaper articles which talk about the fact that inflation has now moved, I think, to 9.1%, which is a 41-year high, which provoked social unrest in the United Kingdom. And there are projections that is going to go even higher, to 11% soon. And we should consider this information. I know that when Professor Robinson spoke, he said that you have to hit a 50% inflation threshold for you to start really experiencing problems, because the world economy actually accommodates a certain amount of inflation. And there's a global benchmark of 2% for an acceptable rate of inflation, which suggests that the economy is functioning well and is in order, and there's growth and there's the creation of jobs, and everything that has to be done is in fact being done. So we consider the rise in prices against this global benchmark. Clearly, the current inflation rate is well above the benchmark. The situation is even worse in the United States of America, where the inflation rate for the 12-month period ending the 31st of March 2021 was a staggering 8.5%. Of course, this rate has also been moving upwards. In Latin America and the Caribbean, apart from Argentina, Haiti, Suriname, and Venezuela, the price of food and fuel jumped 7.1% between January 2021 and November of that same year, according to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. This same commission accurately predicted that inflation would be a serious issue in 2022 and that anti-inflation measures would dominate the attention of policymakers this year. The annual rate of inflation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was just over 3% last year, according to the Statistical Office. And the highest price rises were seen in the following groups of goods and services: housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels experienced a 6.8% increase in prices. In respect of transport, there was a 4.5% increase in prices, and food and non-alcoholic beverages experienced a price level rise of 4.2%. The retail price for a 20-pound cylinder of cooking gas moved from $31.85 in December 2020 to $42.40 in December 2021, representing an increase of 33%. The average price for the 25-pound cylinder of cooking gas increased by a similar order of magnitude. I have estimated that the increase in the price of cooking gas cost households an extra $4 million in 2021, which amounts to just over an extra $100 per household over the course of the year. In terms of electricity, the price of 140 kilowatt hours of electricity moved from $96.70, of which $26.70 was the amount associated with the fuel surcharge, and the fuel surcharge rate was 19 cents per kilowatt hour in December 2020. So that price, $96.70 for 140 kilowatt hours in December 2020, and it moved to $129.89, with the fuel surcharge component now being $59.89, and you could see that this is a substantial rise. This, in fact, translates to a 34.32% increase in the cost of electricity. And I want you to remember that what we're doing here in this initial instance is comparing the price of December 2020 with the price of December 2021. If we assume, in other words, we have not entered the realm of 2022, if we assume that the households of SVG consume 120 million kilowatt hours of electricity in a year, then the total increase in the cost of electricity for Vincentian households was about $28.5 million. That's an extra charge on Vincentian households. We saw that there was an increase associated with the new price of the cooking gas of about $4 million, and we see here that the price increase for electricity cost households just under about $30 million. This means that the average Vincentian household paid an additional $900 or so in electricity costs over the course of 2021, with some assumptions. Essentially, the estimated increase in the price of energy bills, which is to say gas bills for home and electricity bills for home for the average household in 2021, as compared with 2020, was around $1,000. So on these areas, each household was paying about $1,000 more. By way of comparison, in the United Kingdom, energy bills rose by 54%, and this on average led to an additional £693 in annual expenditure for the average household in Britain and took the annual fuel bill expenditure for the typical British household to £2,000, the corresponding figure for St. Vincent and the Grenadines is probably, according to my estimations, about $3,750. So annually, Vincentian households would spend between cooking gas and electricity bills around, on average, $3,750. The price, so that's in the household now, and we want then to move on to look at the price of fuel at the pump. You could see from the survey results which were presented by Professor Robinson that Vincentians are concerned about three principal areas when it comes to inflation. One of them, and he did mention that similar results were found for Barbados. One of those areas, the price of electricity. Another of those areas is the price of fuel, diesel, and gasoline at the pump. And the third area is, I suppose, the bread and butter area, the price of food. So we track those three areas in terms of the priorities that were used for the purpose of this presentation this evening. So in respect of gas, the price of a gallon of unleaded petrol rose from $10.50 in December 2020. Remember, that's our base comparison point in time, from December 2020 to $14.48 in December 2021. We of course know that it has moved even further in this year. But that already, before all the activity of this year, is an increase in the cost of fuel of 38%. Substantial increase. So, and I've estimated that the increase in the price of gasoline costs consumers or drivers an extra $13 million in 2021, which translates into an estimated $650 or so per driver or consumer of gas over the course of the entire year. So we're looking at the additions in cost incrementally as we move along. The increase in the price of unleaded petrol is comparable to what we have seen elsewhere, for instance in the UK, where the price of gas cars and gasoline increased by 40%. This means that the extra costs faced by consumers because of higher energy bills and gasoline bills is of the order of $1,650. So each consumer on average, of course, there are different consumption patterns for different consumers, so it would vary, but on average, you have an extra $1,650 built in to your annual costs, which translates, when you consider all Vincentians, to an amount approximating $45.5 million. This is with respect, again, to energy costs at home and to gasoline costs at the pump, and does not factor in higher food prices. The general price of food also increased in the period under consideration, again, December 2020 versus December 2021, as illustrated below by reference to select commodities. Eggs, for instance, increased 13.58%. Chicken back increased 15.52%. White sugar, loose white sugar, rose by 22.91%. Vegetable oil rose by 23.81%. By the way, the price of codfish went down in this period. I found this to be quite interesting. Nonetheless, it is fair to say that there has been a general uptick in prices during 2021. The trend of rising prices continued in 2022 as captured by the following details. One, the price, and this information was gleaned from the monthly statistical bulletin, which I think is a very good source of information on inflation. And if you want to have an appreciation for the subject, I recommend it to you highly. But the price of a small loaf of white bread, a 5-pack, increased by 13.2%. Well, I'm looking at the price increases now as they relate to 2022 on a month-by-month basis. We look at the increase in price over the course of a year. Now we're going to see that some prices have jumped even over the course of a single month. The price of a small loaf of white bread, as I was mentioning, a 5-pack, increased by 13.2% in January 2022. So that's just the increase for January. The price of a pound of beef or pork increased, as many of you may know, from $9 to $10 in February 2022, and that is actually an 11.1% increase in price. The price of chicken neck increased by 20.9% in February 2022. The price of corned beef, a popular commodity, increased by 9.6% in March 2022 and by a further 13% in April 2022. So we might have to launch a corned beef watch. The price of tomato ketchup shot up by an alarming 41.2% in March 2022. These figures should be noted. I should also flag the fact that in March 2022, there was a substantial increase in the price of school meals, as set out below. Chicken lunch increased by 40%. Bread and chicken increased by 33.3%. And the price of pizza increased by 33.3% as well. Substantial increases in the cost of food for students, something we should pay attention to. We have also seen increases in the price of lumber, galvanized, and other construction material, as well as many other items in the entire range of goods and services. This bout of inflation disturbed, as Professor Robinson was saying, an extended period of price stability in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, I want to go to speak about something which I mentioned before, but which I think should be at the heart of our considerations when we think about inflation as a subject. And this is the fact that the increase in food prices would have or typically has a disproportionate effect on poor or low-income households. This is why I said earlier in my introduction that it is expensive to be poor. In the first place, poor individuals are by definition especially vulnerable to upward price movements because they have no financial buffer zone or breathing space. They spend a substantial portion of their income on food. Additionally, the evidence suggests that the prices of the goods they typically purchase have increased by more in percentage terms than the overall inflation rate. I've already provided local inflation figures on various commodities like eggs, corned beef, chicken back, and vegetable oil, which substantiate this point. I'd also like you to have the benefit of international research on this matter. In the UK, the group of persons who receive unemployment benefits, which is roughly analogous to the group of persons on public assistance or poor relief in SVG, spent 14% of those benefits on energy costs in 2022. The corresponding figure moved to 18% in 2021 and stood at the dangerously high level of 33% in April 2022. I believe that an analysis of the spending of public assistance recipients in St. Vincent and the Grenadines would produce similar results. The cost of basic goods in the UK has risen far more than the official consumer price index. And Professor Robinson described or provided a definition of the consumer price index, or at least referred to it. So the price of these basic goods has risen far more than the official consumer price index figure. You take, for instance, the cost of the cheapest bag of pasta in a UK supermarket increased by a staggering 141%. The price of the cheapest bag of rice moved from 45 pence, to use the UK currency, per kilogram bag to £1 for a kilogram bag, which is equivalent to a price increase of 344%. The price of baked beans, a popular commodity in the UK, is also up 45%. And the price of a small bag of apples is up 51%. Again here making the point that the price of the goods which are used by poor persons more typically increase by a greater degree than the inflation itself. The Food and Agriculture Organization said that global food prices have risen to their highest recorded level. Cereals were up 40% as of mid-April when compared to March 2021. Wheat prices are up 50%, apparently due to panicked investors. Cooking oil was up 55%, and meats are up 20%. The global trends are reflected in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we could look at some factors which cause inflation. The increase in food prices is to some extent attributable to the increase in fertilizer prices. The production of fertilizer is very energy dependent. The price of oil, therefore, has an effect on the price of fertilizer. The price of fertilizer in Britain went from £250 per ton to £1,000 per ton. The war in Ukraine has aggravated inflation. To be sure, the price of oil was already moving upwards before the advent of the war, but it has certainly aggravated the situation. And Professor Robinson alluded to the pride of place that Ukraine has, and Russia too, in the supply of certain essential commodities, and made the point that this might not immediately hit you in the face if you are not looking for that information. Take, for instance, the fact that Ukraine is the 8th largest producer of wheat and the world's largest producer of sunflower oil. Russia and Ukraine are collectively responsible for 1/3 of the world's wheat supply. That's a serious chunk of the world's wheat supply. So conflict in that zone must have repercussions throughout the entire world. The war disrupted supply chains, created shortages, and led to higher prices for these commodities. In general, the price of a commodity can increase because of two main factors. One, greater demand for it, which we know as demand pull inflation, or two, an increase in the price of inputs, which we call cost push inflation. The inflation that we are seeing right now is mainly cost push inflation, an increase in prices as a result of higher cost of oil and the war between Russia and Ukraine. We also probably have a measure of inflation that is attributable to the fact that post-lockdown, the proprietors of bars, restaurants, hair salons, and other establishments may have raised prices to recoup closure losses and offset higher costs, occasioned, for example, by wage spikes. Ultimately, however, the bulk of the inflation is connected to fuel prices and the war. We have already seen that the main drivers of inflation are food and fuel prices. These prices are politically and socially very sensitive in a situation where the average household spends over 50% of its income on food and fuel. Incidentally, inflation is not a one-directional phenomenon. Prices can fall, that is, deflation can take place, possibly because of advancement in technology or access to cheaper labor abroad, which can help to increase the supply of a product. Obviously, the factors which cause inflation are beyond our control. However, the government can respond to inflation with measures that reduce its impact on our cost of living. And I'd like to look at some of the government measures with respect to inflation. We can think of inflation as a shock to the local economy. This shock originated abroad and basically penetrated into our society from the outside world. We can quantify the size of the shock in the same way that we can quantify the magnitude of an earthquake on the Richter scale. We get a sense of the quantification by adding up the total additional annual costs that would confront Vincentian consumers as a result of inflation in the form of higher energy bills, petrol costs, and food prices. I think, based on my assessment and analysis of it, that we are dealing, and including all components, including the cost of fuel and food, that we are dealing with a shock of magnitude around $80 million. We must assess the response of the government to inflation in light of the foregoing information. Essentially, the government has to decide how it is going to deal with or respond to the shock. Is it going to allow the shock to come in from outside the country and penetrate to the population without any form of abatement or mitigation? Or is it going to absorb some or all of the shock by way of fiscal policy through the provision of subsidies? If the government chooses to absorb at least some of the shock, it must consider how it is going to finance the associated subsidies. It may consider debt financing or financing from revenue, in which case we must look at the composition of its revenue, tax revenue, non-tax revenue, excise duties, and so on, in order to determine if any of its revenue streams are sufficiently strong and robust to allow it to be tapped to raise more revenue through fiscal adjustments. These are some of the considerations that a government must keep in mind when it is crafting an inflation response package. What can create jobs better? What investments should we make in infrastructure? What can we do to enhance productivity? What can shield shocks? How do we improve our food security? And this is a point which I think has special resonance for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because I think that we could enhance our position as far as food security is concerned. I was seeing some information on countries of the Caribbean and the percentage of the food which is consumed locally, which is actually produced in that country. And I don't think we have attained the level of 50%, but I'm not sure if there is anything that should restrict us from attaining that level. So food security is a very important thrust, and not just in terms of agricultural produce, but there's a push in the realm of fisheries at this time as well. So how do we improve our food security? And what can we do about energy security, which also is fundamental, because you would appreciate that half of our problems right now are associated with energy security. The government of SVG chose to absorb some of the inflation shock using fiscal policy. In the circumstances, I believe that it came up with an appropriate and carefully calibrated response. We must remember that the government was and is operating under constraints imposed by a confluence of economic circumstances which had the effect of tying its hands. Normally, a government responds to inflation in two ways. One, reduction in public spending, otherwise described as fiscal policy, and two, increase in interest rate, monetary policy. Monetary policy, to some extent, is actually outside of the control of this government. The reduction in public spending is meant to reduce the demand for products because of the fact that less money will be in circulation, placing downward pressure on the demand for goods and services, and hence reducing inflation. In normal circumstances, this type of spending reduction is fraught with risks associated with fostering stagflation, which is a condition of low growth and high inflation, and that is a debilitating economic condition. The prospect of stagflation looms even larger in the current post-pandemic and post-eruption scenario of depressed growth. The government therefore had to consider an element of fiscal stimulus. Nonetheless, we couldn't exactly embark on a wanton spending spree in subsidies, because that in and of itself would have inflationary effects. In any case, where would we have found the money for such a spending spree? The world is currently saddled by high debt and deficit burdens as a result of borrowing to meet financial needs during the pandemic. In 2020, there was the largest increase in debt in a single year since the Second World War. The pandemic widened the deficit and debt for all countries of the world. The level of global public debt is now expected to stabilize at about 95% of GDP over the medium term, which is 11 percentage points higher than it was at before the pandemic. This limits, naturally, access to credit. Additionally, a normal response to inflation in terms of monetary policy is to increase the interest rate. However, this would have the effect of raising the cost of borrowing on credit markets. That is, the cost of funds on the credit market would be higher than usual. Additionally, the pandemic limited the scope for financing a relief package by new taxes because of the general state of the economy. So these are the circumstances in which the government was required to craft a response to inflation. The government was therefore in a situation where it had to finance relief measures in difficult circumstances without aggravating inflation. It had to find a way of increasing spending without increasing it too much. In these circumstances, I think it may have found something of a balance. The government chose to deploy targeted subsidies as part of a relief package. We have already established that the main drivers of inflation were food and fuel prices. The subsidies therefore targeted those areas. In other words, we did not have an indiscriminate application of relief provisions. This helped to achieve the balance between an element of stimulus and inflation control. This is why I say that the response was carefully calibrated. I would now like to make a few additional points about the government's response to inflation. One, debt relief. Importantly, the government was able to secure relief on its outstanding debt to Petrocarib, which may amount to as much as $180 million. This gave it more fiscal space and room for maneuver. Significantly, it gave us greater freedom to explore debt financing options without being crushed by the combination of high debt and high interest rates. The government used some of the fiscal space to invest in the fishing industry, which is connected to some of the considerations I mentioned earlier: jobs, productivity, food security, and shielding from shocks. I am not aware that the government has raised taxes in areas of robust income streams. It seems to me as if a balance has been found. Parenthetically, I continue to marvel at the extent of the extraordinary generosity that was built into the Petrocarib agreement. In a way, the agreement puts us in the position of an oil-producing country in that we benefit to an extent from higher oil prices. The higher the oil price, the more favorable the terms of the Petrocarib agreement, believe that or not. This is what I consider to be the genius of Petrocarib and the reason why I believe that the Petrocarib agreement is a most effective instrument of integration for the Americas. We should keep in mind that integration was one of the foundational principles of the Bolivarian Revolution. There's also been a subsidy, too, on cooking gas, or LPG. The government is subsidizing cooking gas in that it removed the customs service charge on it, and this resulted in modest savings for consumers due to a small reduction in the price of that commodity at a cost to the government. Yeah. 3, subsidy on electricity. The government subsidized electricity in the amount of $800,000 for the month of May. It's just the month of May alone. This had the effect of reducing the rise in fuel surcharge. The fuel surcharge was due to rise by 14 cents from 58 cents per kilowatt hour in April to 72 cents per kilowatt hour in May. This would have been the single largest increase in fuel surcharge rate and would have put the fuel surcharge at its highest level, at least for this century, surpassing the previous high point of 67 cents per kilowatt hour in 2008. However, the government intervened and decided to absorb half of the natural increase, 7 cents per kilowatt hour, and therefore the fuel surcharge only rose to 65 cents. This is taking nothing away from the fact that that is still unusually high level. Previously, the government had waived the customs service charge on fuel purchased by VINLEC. Additionally, VINLEC will benefit from a 35% discount on the fuel it purchases from PetroCaribe, which is always good because this is a benefit that could be passed on that has been derived without actual expenditure on the part of the state. I estimate that these measures, if they are continued over the course of the year, will save consumers something in the region of $30 million. For subsidy on diesel and gasoline, the government is subsidizing fuel at the pump. It removed 50% of the excise tax on diesel and gas. This measure lowers the price per gallon for diesel and gas by $1.05 and $1.50 respectively, and costs the government $1 million per month. I assume that this will translate into annual savings of around $12 million for consumers if it is continued. 5, subsidy on fertilizer. The government less than 2 months ago subsidized a shipment of 7,500 sacks of fertilizer in the amount of $420,000, which had the effect of reducing the cost of fertilizer on the local market. And a very recent development, because if you followed the newspapers lately, you'll notice that on Friday, the Eastern Caribbean group of companies announced an increase in the price of flour. And in relation to flour, the government, that's actually a reduced increase, because in relation to flour, the government was able to negotiate a reduced increase in the price, which took effect yesterday, thereby saving customers who purchased from distributors $7.30 on the price of a 100-pound bag of flour. I mean, I say all this noting, again, a very vital and central point that Professor Robinson made, and that is, if you are generating VAT from a higher base figure, then the amount you actually collect in VAT is going to increase. But still, the point holds that you're not going to pay the normal market price, notwithstanding that fact. In respect of flour, so the purchasers of flour from distributors will save $7.30 per 100-pound bag, and this was achieved by the government cutting the customs service charge on flour in half, accounting for $2.80 of the savings. ECGC, or the flour mill, deciding to take $2.20 less on the price it sells to distributors, and a reduction of $2.30 in the markup for wholesalers. So that is a joint approach by stakeholders. Essentially, the government has provided a relief package of $55 million, a relief package of about, I would say, $55 million. I think that the government can consider additional measures in relation to food prices, and I propose targeted interventions like electricity bill discount vouchers and fuel discount vouchers, especially for the operators of minibuses. I think that they are in a peculiar position where you have substantial increases in the price of fuel, and they have been stopped, so to speak, from having corresponding increases in the bus fares. A way to do that without being indiscriminate in the application of a subsidy would be to have fuel discount vouchers, perhaps, that are distributed to the owners and operators of minibuses. And you could have a similar approach in respect to electricity as in relation to VINLEC, so that we maximize efficiency where the subsidy is concerned. The government has also implemented or is implementing a raft of other initiatives that have a bearing on the ability of Vincentians to cope with inflation, which can form the subject of another presentation. So, in conclusion, we have looked at inflation in the world with a specific focus on St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have covered inflation figures, the disproportionate effect of inflation on the poor, and the factors which cause inflation. Additionally, we performed an analysis of the government's response to inflation to date. We believe that it has adopted a carefully calibrated approach, and I hope that you now have a better appreciation for this subject. The situation, as you'd appreciate, is still evolving, and we have to keep monitoring and paying close attention to it until we get out of the woods. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I am sure that's a lot of food for thought. And we had two solid presentations tonight. Let's give both our presenters. Thank you so much, Professor Robinson. Thank you so much, Luke. Anyone in the room, you may have comments, you may have questions, and we would love to hear some feedback from you. We would have a mic roving across the room, so if you have a question or comment, please keep it very short so that we can have diverse engagement on the subject from males, females, younger persons, older persons, and the like. So at this time, if you have a question you would like to ask, please raise your hand. But I know also Professor Robinson indicated that he may come back to make a few points. So Professor Robinson, since I don't see any hands, I'm going to ask you to come back at this time. Okay, I would love to see your hand shoot up. I taught at secondary level, and I need to see clearly if you want. Sure, please stand.
I think everybody can hear right.
But for the virtual audience. Yes, so please use the microphone as well, because we want our virtual audience to be engaged in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. A pleasant good night to all. Thank you very much for both of you for your presentations. My issue is I heard a lot of the raising prices, which directly affects the consumers, the citizens of the country. At that same point, I never heard of any mention of any increase in salaries. And I think this is something that is fundamentally wrong with the whole situation as it is with inflation. So everything goes up, and everybody gets a piece of the pie because the government gets more taxes when things come in at higher prices, as Luke was mentioning. But the consumers are not seeing any ease, you know? So I really think something needs to be considered, and we need to revisit the salaries. Even the minimum wage is definitely too low to be able to deal with some of the inflation that we are facing. So that's my major point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know I'm not an economist, so I would defer to the technical persons on the topic. Recently I actually listened to another Vincentian on that said issue, Dr. Delano De Souza, and he is currently at the University of the West Indies campus, and he was making the point about the corresponding rise in salaries and wages may also be another measure to create even a greater push for inflation. So I would have one of our presenters tonight speak on the topic so that we could have some.
So I'll take a stab at that. So and that's often one of the difficulties. You know, prices going up, you want your salaries to go up, but you probably don't think of that. Just think of that not through the eyes of economics, but in a sense, the price that you pay for a good or service, the cost of the labor is part of the price you pay. So it's part of the cost of producing. So one of the problems with raising salaries is that you are increasing the cost of producing, which itself can drive further inflation. So so in a sense, it's the one thing you want. I mean, prices have gone up, you want more money, but actually salary increases would really amount to adding fire to, so it's really adding fuel to the fire. I mean, you raise the question of the minimum wage, and that's an interesting policy response in terms of targeting your response to the most vulnerable. Okay, so persons at the minimum wage, I certainly fit in that bucket, and if you, so that's certainly, so I wouldn't support general salary increases. That's just really adding fuel to the fire because it's a cost. But however, minimum wage, targeting at the most vulnerable, I think certainly it is an interesting idea for consideration. Luke, anything you want to add?
Just to agree with you on the point of minimum wage, and I think that that is under active consideration at this time, and I hope that it moves to the point where we could implement new minimum wages in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I think that when you look at some of the categories, you would say that the wages specified there are really outdated. And when we say that though, we should also consider the name very carefully. The name is minimum wage. It's not a maximum wage, and even though it is true that some employers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines pin their payments to the minimum wage, I believe that there's still some good persons out there like Brother Martin Laborde in the audience who will be well above minimum. But the challenge about salary increase, and this is one thing, the point that is raised by Idisha is a popular point. The fact that you have increases in prices, but you don't have increases in salary. In fact, it is a point that is made sometimes to me by members of my staff. So it's a popular point, but there are issues that come with it from the standpoint of inflation. And it is true that maybe interventions that might have an impact on those who are most directly or most vulnerable to price rises may have a role to play. And then there's also the possibility that the inflationary effects might end up not being permanent, to an extent, and we could hope for that rainbow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have Mr. Laborde.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Congratulations to both Professor and Luke on a very excellent presentation. I want to make about 3 points. I think Luke hit on the last point he made in relation to the fact that inflation goes in peaks and troughs. So if you were to just 5% salary increase, for example, and that becomes permanent. And so when you have to have a relationship between increase in salary and the peaks and troughs of inflation, because when it then goes down, as you see, we had a 13-year consistent low, so to speak, and then you increase salaries to such an extent, then you could create a permanent problem. One, for the company, and within the national sphere. That's one. Secondly, the issue of priorities. A lot of people at the poor level complain a lot about price increases, but spend $7.5 million a month on national lottery, and another $7 million on cell phone. And most of that is not driven by the higher echelons of society. It is driven by mostly poor people. You'll be amazed to know that. I live it every day, see it every day, hear the cry every day. And then the issue with regard to price increases. Luke has given a lot of figures, and the situations may be a little bit even worse than what he has shared, except on ketchup. Maybe you're buying the wrong brand. Because my brand hasn't increased at all for the year since 2020. But it is driven, a lot of the price increase today is really driven on the output side by shipping costs. It's a major challenge to the point it is actually threatening the national security in small island states. You take, for example, a lot of the goods that are sourced out of Asia and Eastern Europe. You have, and I give you a typical example, a 20-foot container out of China that was about $3,500 is now between 15 and 17,000 US dollars. Out of Malaysia, the same thing. Out of Argentina, you're talking about from $3,500 to about $7,500. The only place I think in the Caribbean that has not moved is Trinidad and Tobago, because even out of Guyana, it has moved up by about 40%. So, and that is on the output side. And we were realizing price increases on the output side before we start realizing it on the input side, in the sense of the raw material cost to produce the goods. So you take, for example, Athena Robert salami went up between 2021 and say March 2022 by about 17%. But by next month, when the next shipment comes in, it is going up a further 23, 24%. And that has primarily to do with the input costs catching up now, and also the input of the output costs in terms of the freight, etc., etc. Now, the last point I want to make, well, the government has done a lot of intervention, targeted intervention, which I think is the right approach, as said by both speakers. I think there's more that can be done. I have a long letter that I was writing the government in terms of some of the approach I think they ought to take. And in my view, with all honesty, and I'm not pulling political punches here, the mere fact that you're earning a lot more money because of the increase in the cost of goods suggests that there are points at which you can reduce the cost of customs. My suggestion was that you take off a couple percentage points off the VAT. Now you will say, well, that affect everybody, but everybody feeling the pinch anyway. So you take off 2, 3, 4 percentage points, and you'll be amazed to know how that impacts on people. But there are particular items. Why do we have 40% import duty on coconut oil? The price of a 500 bottle of oil is now equivalent to what a 1 liter bottle used to be. The import tariff rate is 40%. Why? Why is there VAT on lentils? You know who eat lentils? Poor people. The highfalutin people. They eat pigeon peas and red beans and black-eyed beans. It's poor people who eat lentil. Take off the VAT of lentils. And there are number items. Why is it bathing bath soap? It's 30% import duty. Why? That some of those things don't make sense to me. So I think there could be more targeted interventions on specific commodities that will aid the vulnerable.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate suggestions and recommendations from persons who are actually in the environment, business environment. I don't know how Professor Robinson Olu could respond to the suggestions that he has made.
Yeah, again, I mean, those are pretty fair points, and as I was saying to Luke, I mean, I know in Barbados, where we've been doing some work with the government, they are looking at that basket of goods that's zero rated for VAT. Because, you know, sometimes you set up these baskets at a point in time and then consumption patterns change. So certainly that could be an initiative the government could look at in terms of, well, exactly what do you want to zero rate or VAT exempt in terms of the impact on people? So I think those are I think that's a very good point in terms of looking at ways to find relief. And I guess in general, you know, so your government, there is this shock to your society. $80 million, according to Luke's numbers, that's about 10% of GDP. So that's big. So if you're going to be collecting more money, it's really to have those pencils sharpened and figure out how much of the windfall are you going to give up to actually buffer that shock. But I guess I come back to something like a stock record but you do have to target it. Because if you go across the board, you know, men like Dougal James have money, you don't want to give him all the relief. You know, you have to kind of take him. So you want to make sure that you're not giving monster relief. Because, again, it's important because when you're at a certain level of income, you just cannot substitute different goods. So depending on your income level, you could decide, well, I'm not going to have this cut of meat, I'm going to have a lesser cut, etc. But persons at a certain income level, they spend most of their income on their basic goods and they don't have the capacity to substitute. So allowing those persons to keep life, limb, and dignity together needs to be the priority within the limited resources.
Thank you so much. Any further questions or comments? Sure. We hear from P.S. Knight.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And both presenters, I really must thank you for the information shared. I mean, I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask one to comment. Quite interesting survey, but there are a number of things that popped out at me. But I just would like to understand from you, if you can conclude at this point in time, how do you view the current rate of inflation in terms of what you may perceive could be the impact on present earnings or the value of person's salary? And also, whether you may view that as a cause or point of concern at this stage. Just a few comments before I leave. The questions I know are very broad. But I would also like to understand whether or not, from the questions and the response, whether you can draw any conclusions about the responses, what particular group they may have emanated from, and also some of the questions that's zeroing on fuel and stuff like that. You know, the types of vehicles, whether persons drove for pleasure or for work, etc. I know you may not have captured some of that sort of information, but it might be interesting to understand some of those sort of things. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. And I realize that you really put on your hat as the former Director of Trade in St. Vincent, the Grenadines there. I see Mr. Currency, your hand was up. Okay, so Okay, so just to ensure that we don't lose any of the questions, we'll take them one at a time.
I'm not as young as Luke, so I want to take the question before I forget. So in terms of, the way I want to respond to your question is that while we have focused a lot on assisting the more vulnerable, I also often in these discussions, particularly in our Caribbean society, to also put in a plug for the emerging middle class. And that because they are vulnerable in a different way than sometimes the lower income, in that sometimes low income people can respond to an income shock in a slightly different way from middle class person, in the sense that they might not have a mortgage, they might not have a car loan and so on. So the vulnerability of the middle class often comes that they are locked into a set of loans. And a 10% reduction in their purchasing power over a period of time can certainly push those persons into an uncomfortable zone. And sometimes that group tends to get ignored in crafting policies which are focused. So I would certainly, so for example, the IMF just put out a report and they were very critical of the fact that in Barbados that we would have reduced the value-added tax on gasoline and government capped statistics. Now their view is that that's not good policy because both rich people benefit from that. But I think as the board said, you know, everybody is in the economy. And they are middle class or working people. So in terms of their own productivity, they may need to drive a car to manage the career they're doing. I mean, can you do a certain job or type of career effectively if you have to rely on public transport? So I think the shock to that group is something that 10% increase in prices or so you're talking about, it can be a significant shock to that group that have a lot of fixed commitments. And even at a more basic level, I think what we underestimate sometimes is what those types of persons are carrying. Huh? Sometimes they are the stable person in their family network. They have a certain job, and sometimes we look at them and say they eat out, they're doing this and that, but sometimes we forget that that group is often carrying other members of their family as well. You know, they might be the one who made it, quote unquote, and they have a nephew, and you know that situation is not so stable, and they're helping out there, and so on. And they are quite vulnerable in a different kind of way to the low income. And I'm often concerned that they get overlooked in terms of policy measures, because they can really get pushed into some very uncomfortable financial territory. Yeah, in terms of the surveys, it's really quite challenging doing some of these surveys in this COVID environment where ideally you would want to go out to people and you could get responses, so you are relying on an online survey. I am reasonably comfortable that we have a good cross-section of Vincentians, from the persons that I relied on to share the message using WhatsApp. I mean, I think one of the benefits of the current age is from top to bottom have WhatsApp on their phone, so when you circulate. So I do think we get a good cross-section of the society, and a person who don't have a vehicle indicated they spend nothing on fuel and so on. So I think we have a good snapshot at a point in time. And what I found useful was that the survey findings did corroborate the actual data that Blue had. So that really zeroed it. So I'm quite comfortable with what we're getting out of that survey. Thanks.
Just to make the point that the question from my PS really asks is about whether or not persons at their current level of income could in general cope with inflation. And I'm not sure that we have the information at hand that allows us to answer that decisively. I remember that during the course of my presentation I spoke about how a particular group of persons, those persons who were on benefits in the UK, how the proportion of those benefits that was spent on utilities, I think it was, changed over time. It initially was 14%, and then it moved to I think 18% between, and then in 2022 it got to 33%. So the question is that I think the PS was asking is basically what percentage now of the average salary is being spent on certain commodities. Is it past a point of difficulty, past a point where it becomes difficult for that person to continue to make ends meet? What is the breaking point? Those questions, I think, need precise research. But you have an idea of what's going on from some of the content of the presentation I made. I think the suggestion was that it was stated that the typical consumer with respect to electricity and gas costs, fuel at the pump, is paying about $1,650 more per year. So that could be translated into a monthly increase. And we have some preliminary data that would give some directions, because, for instance, the statistical bulletin provides information on what percentage of a person, of the average household income, is spent on different items. What percentage is spent on food? What percentage? So if we see that a significant percentage is already spent on some areas and there's an increase of a certain amount, then we might be able to make conclusions as to whether that increase drives a person over the limit. But that would be something that has to be, I suppose, researched specifically so that a precise answer could be provided. And since I'm just back to the mic for the first time since Mr. Laborde spoke, I'd just like to thank him for his suggestions. You know, one of the popular policy responses for governments as captured by IMF research has been to adjust VAT on different commodities. And there doesn't seem to be an appetite here for that sort of an intervention at this point. But maybe it is something that is under consideration, and we might hear the results of such consideration in due course. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your responses. Mr. James and Mr. Currency.
Good night.
Good night.
Well, Abdul James and the two esteemed speakers, Justin and I, are both over 50. And we have known each other before we were teenagers and have been friends. And Luke was one of my young cricketers whom I managed in the St.Vincent Grenadines cricket team. So I'm quite familiar with them. Now, when we look at this whole situation, St.Vincent Grenadines is in a situation where we have shown that we have been resilient, in that we are coming out of COVID, we have the Lassa Fray eruption, and now the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war. And inflation has been with us and will continue to be with us for the longest while. And this intervention, I think, is the starting point for a new conversation and the way forward for St. Vincent and the Grenadines that will either make or break us. Because price level increases will remain, but what we need now is to zero in on what areas of the economy is these price changes affecting in terms of the development plan that both political parties, not just the government, have for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Because you hear that tourism and agriculture and services are the ones to look at. And all three are affected in some way by inflation. And personally, I think that there's now the need for a new conversation. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of agriculture, because I've been speaking about import substitution, agricultural diversification, and all those are affected by the percentage of imports in the absorption mix in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And what we want now in this conversation is a new breed of persons taking ownership and being given the opportunity to make contributions. Because for too long, we have been hearing about these interventions, and persons gave their opinion, and at the end of the day, all you hear, yes, I hear you, but this is my view. And in a lot of cases, that view really is just spinning top in mud. So to be effective, we must deal with issues that will make agriculture more efficient. And in doing that, new players must be recognized and given the opportunity to flourish. Because in my humble opinion, temporary stopgap measures just have us going round and round and round. So we must put more resources available, and also some of the stuff that we import that Mr. Laborde spoke about, we can produce them here efficiently if measures are put in place. Also, we have to look at the stuff that where does the government earn its income from in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have to look at that. Most of it's from taxation, income tax, and those issues. And once we have a policy that deals mainly with just intervention from the government side all the time. What we find is that prices will just be up and down. It's like you stop in one hole to make a next one, and those kind of things. So we have to look at the whole inflation in terms of the impact on the whole economy and the way forward. And everyone must make an input. We must see farmers and the importers, service providers also must, because inflation affects service, not just the goods. So, Justin, I hope this is just the beginning for you, and you will remain relevant to this issue in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you and Luke, and also ensure that the voices that you encounter along the way are counted. And they're just not just heard to make up numbers or just have an audience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I think the end of your statement really shows that the call to action that Professor Robinson made at the start with the students becoming more engaged is very important. You mentioned quite a few players getting on board, but I think there's quite also room for the foreign policy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines when you consider the fact that we have Russia and Ukraine and the invasion that's happening there, and considering that they are producers of 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley, and the fact that we have unilateral sanctions being imposed on Russia, a major producer, and the fact that the banking system and all these things have issues to do with how the supply and demand is affected, we have to also consider the importance of advocacy and foreign policy in the discussion. So the agriculture and all of that, there's room for that, but there are other little elements that we have to make sure our voice, when I say our, I mean the Vincentians' voice, would be heard in the global arena. Mr. Currency? Oh, sorry, Mr. Browne would like to share something.
Just in response to manage, as I was trained to call him during my cricket playing days, it's interesting that a cricketer is up next as well. We're talking cricket tonight, not necessarily football. But we do have the president of the SVG Football Federation in our midst as well, with a keen interest on this subject. And we have there was a suggestion that we need to take a all across the board approach, all political parties. So I think that we're starting to reflect that in East Kingston. But Manager, I agree that all voices should be counted. This is a forum for voices to be heard and for the messages that are delivered to be transmitted and translated to whatever necessary destination. I think that Professor Robinson has shown that basically he is committed to not just general research, but research very specific to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And that is the first part of the issue of making sure that voices are counted and find expression in policy. You also make the point about the need. One of the things I'd just like to, you said several things, but I'd just like to pick up a bit on what you said concerning the need for agriculture to be more efficient and other industries too, tourism, because, as a part of a national development trust, we have to make sure that in every area we are as efficient as possible given the competitive nature of the world economy. But yes, agriculture has to be more efficient, and I just wanted to emphasize an aspect of my presentation which I think has a bearing on that, because when you have this challenge, I wouldn't quite call it a crisis, but you have a challenge which requires the intervention of the government, and the government could intervene in such a way that it makes things more efficient. We see an intervention, for instance, that that is connected to an investment by the government and private stakeholders in an upgrade of our fishing vessels, for instance, and that definitely would make fishing more efficient. And that was occasioned by the circumstances of the inflation situation, and we're responding to that by injecting loans that will do some of the things, injecting loans and assistance that will do some of the things that I had emphasized in the presentation. What can create jobs better? Because if the government is going to invest in a relief package, so to speak, it must make sure that at the end of the relief package, we emerge a better St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So what can create jobs better? I just wanted to rivet these particular questions in your mind, because when you're assessing how the government has done or is doing on this score, these are sort of the benchmarks against which you could do that assessment. What can create jobs better? What investments should we make in infrastructure? To an extent, efficiency in agriculture is tied to having appropriate infrastructure. Do we have the right technology for agriculture? Do we have the right factories? Do we have the right system of work? You know, a whole host of considerations are tied into that question. What should we do in terms of infrastructure? What should we do to enhance productivity? Productivity and efficiency are almost synonyms, basically. And what can shield shocks? And very fundamentally, what can improve our food security? I think that these questions all speak to some of what you were trying to bring out in your comments a while ago.
Thank you so much. Mr. Currency.
Good night to everybody. Good night, Luke, Professor. Much of what I wanted to say, Dougal said it, and Luke elaborated on it. But I will say a little bit more. Now, you spoke about price of food, price of electricity, gasoline, and so on being major factors at play. Now, gasoline, we can't control that. That's exogenous. We have no control over that. Obviously, once gasoline goes up, diesel goes up, price of electricity goes up. What can we control? We're going to mention it, agriculture. Now, I don't think we pay enough attention to it, frankly speaking. And I'll give you an example. I live in acres and farming area. And it's quite difficult to get people to do work for you in farming, you know. It's very, very, very difficult. No, I don't know if this is not seen as if it's seen as something unsexy, but no. It's a serious thing, because it's very, very difficult to get reliable people to come every day or every other day to do work for you. Mm-hmm. Now, there's this rhetoric constantly we hear about the importance of agriculture, fisheries, and so forth. But the stopgap measures that Dougal spoke about, are they really useful in the long run? To change the generation, what do we do? To change the way of thinking, because to me, you have to change the way we are thinking. But how do we get that done? You have to start at the grassroots level. Same thing with sport. To increase the productivity of West Indies cricket, football, you look at the grassroots level. But have we started at the grassroots level when it comes to agriculture? Look at the schools. Is agriculture being taught in every primary school, in every secondary school? Yet we talk about it often, regularly, what we're going to do with agriculture. We need agriculture, but it's seen as unsexy. But are we serious? But we have to ask the question, and look at the universities themselves, because I really think the universities should be admonished. They need to hold a lot of the blame. I don't know 2 persons who do agriculture in university. But I know about 500,000 who do management and so on computer. But you understand the point I'm making? What are we doing? If you're really serious about this thing, you have to start at the grassroots level. You have to start at primary schools, Form 1. These things have to be compulsory. You continue with an education system that was promulgated by who knows who, those people in England or something. To what? To what extent? Where are we going? You have to be serious with these things, yeah? Now, I wrote down something here. I can't see it. but the point I think is a serious point. We really have to start at the grassroots level if we really want to see change. And it's not just agriculture. You can look at tourism, because the two things that we keep harping about is agriculture and tourism. Yes, when you go to Kingston, people just throw garbage on the ground like nothing. You don't know the value of a tourism dollar. We don't know how the money works. These things are not being taught in school. So to me, while we're looking at these nice stopgap measures, reduce VAT there, it's well and good, all fine. But Mr. Laborde spoke earlier on about how inflation goes up and down. I think that is evident from what we heard from Luke and Professor. So what's going to happen 30 years? Okay, let's say next 2 years we come out of this inflation scenario. We are good again. Next 30 years the same thing happens. We haven't put anything in place. So the universities, they have to change. Schools. They really have to change. The education system has to change. The mindset, we have to change the mindset. So you have to start at the very start, at the very, very bottom. Right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Currency. I definitely agree with you on your suggestions for the incorporation of agriculture and basically soft education that would lead to a better tourism product. Yes, Mr. John? Sure.
Okay, good night, everyone. Special greetings to our panelists.
Good night.
When I received my invitation, and it's interesting that the invitation came all the way to Barley. They drove to Barley despite the price of gas to bring the invitation to me. They find it to be very special. Quite interesting. Immediately, I wrote down the questions I would ask that I sought answers for before I came. And of the 5 questions I wrote, 4 were adequately addressed. What is inflation? The conditions that give rise to inflation, the impact of inflation. What can government do in response? There's only one question that wasn't addressed, and I have it here. What can the average citizen do to reduce the impact of inflation from the household level? So I will ask my, and then 2 questions came up from listening to the discussion. Who is really poor? We'll be hearing reference to poor people, but I think we need a technical definition of poor in this context. And finally, something that mystifies me. You speak about food and fuel. But there's another industry which I refer to as the frolic industry. People seem not to be restrained to the extent that they expend on frolic. I'm wondering if our panelists could explain that. Why do we expend so much? And if that is a kind of a response, a defense mechanism for the situation which we find ourselves. And let me end by congratulating Luke again. I recall the Behold the Man series, and this kind of venture is very much welcome, and I think we should have more of it. Thank you very much.
So just to go over, there are 3 questions. What can the average man or the average household do to help to mitigate some of the inflationary effects? Who is really poor? And what of the frolic industry? I believe Professor Robinson spoke in his presentation about the inflationary effects having an effect on mental health of some 56% of the population. So I would love to hear more on these three questions.
Trust me, John, to come with three tough questions. Yeah, so again, those are fair and interesting questions that I will seek to provide. So one, who is poor? If I start with that, so that's always a challenge. The World Bank defines poverty as persons living on less than $1 US a day. So that would be what, $365 US in St. Vincent? But yeah, so the 360, because the World Bank tends to define the poverty, like persons are poor at a level of $1 US per day. In Barbados, where I'm most familiar with the data, we tend to work with the income tax, right? So your first $25,000 of income is tax-free. So persons who don't qualify for that tend to be the group you tend to target with relief. So that's about an average of $2,000 a month. You wouldn't think of them as necessarily poor, but vulnerable. So when you are trying to target relief, that's the group you would pull at. I'm not sure what benchmark we use in St. Vincent, but that would certainly be interesting to see. I mean, Barbados, St. Vincent per capita income is about roughly, if it's around half of Barbados, maybe half of that might be a number that you work with. But I often think the income tax roll is probably not a bad place to start. You do have some data on those persons. So that's very much a work in progress. So I don't know how you define it here. $1,800 a month, is it? Yeah. So that's the benchmark we tend to work with in Barbados when you are targeting relief. Persons making less than $25,000 a year is really that group that you are trying to intervene around. Now, what can persons do to respond to the inflationary spike? I think what you can do depends quite heavily, as I've alluded to earlier, on your income bracket. So persons at the middle and the upper end have some capacity to substitute. Okay, you don't eat out as often. You drive less to some extent. You drive less for pleasure. So the response at the level of the middle and the upper income is rarely to substitute or already change your behavior. And that's why I have focused so heavily on the relief for the most vulnerable, because they have limited capacity to substitute. Such a high percentage of their income is going towards the essentials, keeping the light, the water on, some food, getting to and from work. So those persons actually do need relief, and it's quite important that governments intervene in a real and meaningful way. And that goes back to historical times, really, where whoever is in government knows that there are groups that are very vulnerable to, like back then it was increases in the price of bread and wheat, and you always make sure those things are affordable. And I don't think those have changed. What people need now is some access to basic food and that they can keep their light and water on. So I think that group has very limited capacity to respond. In our survey, we did ask persons what they would suggest to other persons, and the word that came up most often was to budget, which in a way is which I guess is another way for substituting. You try to separate your needs from your wants and so on. So that came up as the most frequent response in terms of persons budgeting. And third question, what was the other question? The frolic industry. Well, I guess I go back to that most famous of economists, John Maynard Keynes, where he said, in the long run, we are all dead. It is quite normal that persons want to enjoy life. And again, as Ken said, the ultimate goal of investment is to consume more in the future. Because sometimes we speak as if investment is an end in itself, but humans, ultimately, we get satisfaction from consumption. So if other persons are consuming, doesn't really surprise me at all. I mean, I'm surprised sometimes at the amounts that people are willing to spend on it, but it says a lot about their preferences. And I mean, to put it in terms of economics, what you are saying to us is that the demand for entertainment is relatively inelastic. There does seem to be a lot of evidence that the demand for entertainment is relatively inelastic. And it does suggest that we have more of the population that is operating at a certain level of economic comfort, because we do know that as persons get past that minimum level of satisfying their basic needs, then experiences become more important. So, we notice a lot from a lot of studies around tourism and others that what humans often really put a high value on is the experience. So Pijan, be very careful that you are underestimating the value of the experience of wet fete. Huh? That might provide a level of utility that you may not fully appreciate. But I think you're alluding to an interesting question as to why is the demand for entertainment so inelastic. But I think it's about people satisfying themselves, and and again, in the long run, we all dead, so you have to enjoy something while you're here.
Okay.
Just a few comments. I wanted to say something about what Romel Currency had to say, and his comments are quite important considering the role that he plays within the state administration and his involvement in trade. So I think we should take a lot of that input on board. I wanted to mention or to highlight or to respond specifically to what he said about agriculture and agriculture in schools. I believe, and this is a point which was addressed very forcefully in a book that was written by Michael Manley. He wrote a book entitled The Politics of Change, and he presented some ideas which seem, that book was written some time ago now, but the ideas he presented were novel and perhaps can still be considered groundbreaking up to today, because we have agriculture as being an important mainstay of our economies, but it's not really, students are not exposed to it properly in schools. And students who are exposed to it in schools at some stage might be regarded as students who may not have an aptitude or an interest in other subject areas and so on. So we have to break that type of stigma. And he has some ideas on how we might go about doing that. But more broadly speaking as well, I think that there's scope for us to look at our school system in respect to other areas. Currency made the point that we basically largely imported a foreign school system, and I think that is to some extent true. Well, I was recently studying in England, and I reflected on some aspects of what we took from England, and on how preposterous it might be for us to take some other ideas from the United Kingdom or elsewhere and apply them randomly into St. Vincent and Grenadines. For instance, the public transport system in the UK. We might say it's a model public transport system and so on, but it's built on especially in London, on a network of tunnels, which are very costly and perhaps unnecessary. If you were trying to develop a public transport system for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you're not going to necessarily think that those ideas are relevant. Similarly, I believe that if you go into the education system which was brought here, might not have been nimble enough to cater for some of the peculiarities of Vincentian existence. I heard, for instance, a coach recently making the point that there is still in our framework not sufficient emphasis on the development of athletic talent. how exactly you reform the system so that the talent is developed to its full potential is something that we have to enter consideration of as a nation. So we imported certain ideas wholesale, including ideas which are not quite relevant. In terms of what P. John said, it is true that he has been an old soldier, so to speak, in the journey of these lectures, from the very first one that we put on back in the day, and he asks for more lectures in the future, and we will deliver upon his request.
Thank you very much. Please.
Okay. Good night, everyone. I first of all would like to thank Professor Robertson for an excellent presentation, and also Luke. Very informative session. During Professor Robertson's presentation, you did indicate that in St. Vincent, we take a longer period to come out of the inflation. And that means that the hardship is spread over a longer period. I'm not certain what sort of research is done to determine what are the factors that result in the delay in St. Vincent coming out historically. The other thing, though, is I'm thinking that when we look at the whole aspect of inflation, most of it is imported. But as a lot of the persons have said, the utilization of our resources, I think it goes back to a couple of things. Fiscal discipline, in terms of persons who are consuming, and also education. I think that we need to educate the public much more, because we will see persons gravitating to import products, and we have local products that are available at cheaper costs, more food value, more healthy. In other words, the consumption, just by educating personal household about the importance of eating healthy. It may be eating cheaper. Sometimes people feel eating a more expensive product could improve your health, but it's more, in most cases, the result is the opposite. So you eat expensive or consume expensive import products, high sodium, high salt, and so on, and you have local products here that you can consume, and then you end up with a big medical bill. The other aspect of it is in terms of knowing what your expenses that are controllable, doing your personal budget, a number of factors. A lot of it revolves around, could be improved by increasing the level of education, sensitizing persons out there. Right? And I would like to challenge Luke in terms of getting the message to those persons, especially those persons who are bordering, who are most severely impacted, we say the lower income homeowners and so on. All right? I think we need to do a lot, reach out to them in terms of education. Yeah? That's my contribution.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so very good contribution, questions there from Ruben. So in terms of the St. Vincent having the spikes and coming out, I guess the macroeconomic explanation you would go for would be expectations. So if you're a retailer and you are selling some goods and you anticipate that the next time you order, the price is going to be higher, then you're going to price the goods you are selling now to cater for when you have to get your next shipment. So inflationary expectations can themselves lead to higher prices, which would be the typical macro explanation. It's not clear to me why that would be unique to St. Vincent, so I wouldn't think of that as a particularly good explanation. So it would suggest that it's something microeconomic, something about the structure of the industries and the sector in St. Vincent, and it might be linked to the fact that in particular areas, you might have one or two importers, very limited competition, and so on. So you would look to the microeconomic factors that would really drive that higher than usual prices. And I think it might be that you have relatively few suppliers, not a lot of competition, and a tendency maybe just to just have a straight pass-through of that market. But it's certainly an interesting question in terms of future research. Now, in terms of currency and your response, I think one thing you have to keep in mind is that the St. Vincent project is still a relatively young project, huh? And we are dealing with some relatively complex historical issues, you know. So when I was growing up, the instruction was to, you know, study a book, get a good white-collar job, and move on, and so on. And that has certainly been a big part of our culture, and we certainly need the thought leaders in the country, really, to really have a concerted effort to begin to change that mind shift, because it is part of our psyche that we associate success with certain white-collar type jobs and environments, and that's not going to change overnight. It's not going to change on its own. It's going to require sustained advocacy, and there's also the income level, because I'm aware of a lot. I mean, I've been part of a lot of studies on this in Barbados, and I'm always conflicted because we want people in agriculture, but when we look at the hard data, right, the actual income levels are very different. A bartender in a hotel makes 3 times an agricultural worker. That is the current reality. So in addition to the psyche, certainly where I am most familiar with the data, people are responding to real economic incentives where these agricultural jobs, in terms of agricultural worker, are not particularly high-paying jobs. And that's one of the challenges that we face. So I think it's very much a work in progress. Food security is on people's mind in a way it hasn't been before. Energy security is there in front of us. And I think one of the ways we can really get this where we need it to be is, one, the public advocacy, forums like this, really getting out there, because we think people know things that they don't know. I mean, how many people in a room like this are aware as to how vulnerable we are to a slight rise in the sea level? So we have a duty to make it part of public consciousness. I think there's a major role for public policy. I mean, the major reason I drive an electric car is because there's no duty and there's no value-added tax on an electric vehicle. So an electric vehicle is very cheap to acquire. Because in a sense, the electric car is more expensive than a non-electric to start, so there has been a conscious policy intervention to make it affordable for persons to have electric cars. If you live in Barbados, the single most attractive investment is investing in renewable energy. So if you have solar panels on your house or wind, you can feed into the national grid, and the rate is set that you are guaranteed a 14% return for 20 years. So anybody with roof space is doing something. I mean, I'm building a pagoda in my yard to put on some more panels, because 14% for 20 years. I mean, it's the best gig in town. So there's clearly a major role for concerted public policy to shift that behavior, because we are dealing with some complex historical issues. These islands were not designed to be societies. Huh? They were just designed to extract wealth and take it out. So we now, in the years since independence, we are trying to buck hundreds of years of history. So I think it's a work in progress, but we have to stick with it, and I think the thought leaders have to play a major role in keeping it front of people's mind. But also there is a role for very creative and concerted public policy.
I see persons leaving.
Ooh, this will be our final question. I think we had quite rich discussion so far. Dr. Thompson?
I was listening along, and I wasn't sure with that last statement that these islands were not designed
to be
in whatever way you said, because these islands have lived for a have been around for a long time, and I'm a proud Garifuna, long before the colonialists. But in terms of the analysis of inflation, I'm getting the impression, though, that at least in the Western world, there's a view that coming out of the pandemic, and Luke, you pointed out inflation was well on its way in 2020, 2021, long before the Ukraine crisis. And that now, coming out of the pandemic, if we could say so, that people have this disposable income that they've saved, they haven't been spending, and that they now are prepared for frolic. They need that, and they're spending and so forth. And that may be one of the reasons. But what I want to ask two questions, really. In relation to what Martin, the board had talked about, in terms of shipping and so forth, in your analysis, has there been any evidence that one of the factors, that businesses that couldn't ship, were closed down because of the pandemic, didn't have that income, are now trying to make money, and that inflation is really coming because they were trying to make up on losses that they had over the last 2 years? And whether in Barbados or St. Vincent, there's any component of the inflation that seems to be induced by a kind of excessive prices and so forth being added on top of the shipping and so forth that comes along with it. I think the second question is coming out of what people be saying, and it's a bit of a cliche. Do we let, or can we look at a good crisis and seize the opportunity? Don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think you just touched on it, the opportunities that can come out of this crisis. And I do believe it may well be in the area of agriculture. I've been doing a little research. You know, red onions now have been seen to have a certain substances in it that's a huge antioxidant, quercetin. We know that sweet potato now is no longer a silly food, it's a superfood. And breadfruit, all these soluble fibers. Can we seize on that opportunity for our farmers so that they, as we market these healthy foods, not just for food security, but as a health measure, that they basically can utilize these opportunities? I think that it's an opportunity that we may not be able to produce energy. You mentioned solar and so forth, but we may not be able to produce a lot of the things that we import today. But the things that we can do, the new thinking, I think, is that we have to get in to seeing how we could seize those opportunities so that coming out of this crisis, we can export quality, we can export health, we can export these type of products that I think would be of some greater value. I don't want to...
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. And I think Dr. Thompson raised two important questions there, and I'll just let the presenters respond briefly. Firstly, do we see any correlation between the COVID-19 pandemic and the rising prices by producers, retailers? And also, what are the opportunities that we can take away from this crisis?
In response to what Dr. Thompson said, I'll just say something brief. I know that the night is fast spent, and there are, I believe, some refreshments awaiting you at the conclusion of the lecture. I did allude to the fact during the course of my presentation that an element or a component of the inflation may be due to the fact that I didn't quite say shipping companies, but I said that the proprietors of restaurants and hair salons and those companies which were impacted by the closure could have raised prices more or less to recoup losses in that period. And I think it is possible that a similar thing is taking place with respect to shipping. Maybe the question should be probed some more. And in terms of not allowing the crisis to waste, I think I also just mentioned the fact that there are opportunities coming out of it so long as the government and we ourselves as private citizens take the correct approach to dealing with the challenges associated with inflation. It gives an opportunity for investment in various areas, including agriculture, which I know is one of your babies. So I don't think that we would see, so there's scope for us to make sure that we emerge in a better position from the standpoint of food security, energy security, and resilience to shocks as a result of emerge from this period in a better position. So I think that those are my comments there, and I think it's probably also the last time that I'll be at the mic for tonight, so I'd just like to thank you myself for coming out here. Give yourselves a round of applause, those of you who remain with us. You were able to endure to the end. Professor Robinson would make some comments as well, and I look forward to seeing you at our next public lecture, whenever that may be. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, so as I recognize you there, I say I have fond memories with your late sister in the St. Martin's staff room, Isabel. Yes, so in terms of the pricing, and that's interesting because one of the areas, I'm aware of some studies in St. Lucia, Grenada, Trinidad, one of the areas where prices have fallen has been like people selling clothing and those types of retailers where they weren't moving stock during COVID. So they really were just trying to get rid of stock. So while the prices had been going up, when you do the breakdown, clothing, footwear, some of those items, those prices have actually come down. And that's attributed to those distributors really having not been able to sell their stock during COVID, trying to move their stock. So there may be there's always an element of price gouging. I certainly don't discount it. Of course, they're assuming that the demand for their good is inelastic, so I'm always wary as to how far they can do that without losing too much of their business. And if that's the primary driver of the inflation, we would expect that to be transitory. Because when we started talking about inflation last year, most of the experts were saying, well, nothing to worry about because you have all this pent-up demand from COVID. Supply chains are not going to respond as quickly, so you're going to get some inflation, but it's likely to be transitory as you go back to normal. So I think while that may have been a factor at the start, I think the real drivers now are this Russia-Ukraine war pushing up the price of energy and disrupting global supply chains. There is a real risk, as has happened in the past, that you have a shock. There's a lot of talk about food, energy security, and we see it in the data. When there's a shock, there's a spike in local production, but the shock passes and we go back to our good old ways, and that's how we are as humans. You know, you get sick, the doctor tells you stop drinking and you come out for the first 3-4 months, you don't drink, and then once you feel good, you go back. And we do see that in our economies at a bigger level. When you have these shocks, we see a spike in local production, but once things go back to normal. So I think there are two elements I would see. One, again, a massive role for government and NGOs in terms of trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again by keeping it front of mind and really having an aggressive campaign. And I know Currency spoke. One of the things that worries me from the university is not just so much that we put out a lot of management graduates. What I'm interested to see, and I don't have an answer to, because what I would really like to see is one or couple of these management graduates take agriculture and make it a business. Because I think that's one of the problems we have in that farmers are not business people. Okay, farmers tend to produce, but in terms of selling a product, marketing is extremely important. When we talk about the foreign products, but one of the reasons we go for foreign products is because it is well known that humans respond to marketing. How the product is promoted, how it's packaged, and things, these make a massive difference. And it's not clear in my mind yet why none of these management and other graduates have really sought to take their expertise and really bring some modern marketing techniques towards things like agriculture. Because I think unless we really start to market it, we're going to have the problem where the imported goods are going to be chosen, because that's how humans behave. You respond to promotion, packaging, and the entire product. So I think there's a challenge for the public space. I mean, and that's one of the things I sort of want to close with. I mean, I have been living in Barbados for a long time, and one of the things I've gotten used to is a very vibrant public space, where you have a lot of different voices contending, and it's really not about who knows more than who. It's just that you hear different voices and you then get to choose your policies from around that. And I would really like to see that develop in St. Vincent, that we have a vibrant public space that can cut across the political divide. I mean, I was first appointed to the central bank by Owen Arthur, then by the Prime Minister after, and the one after. And different parties change, but I think having that vibrant public space where you can have vibrant debate, different voices, everyone has their favorite in politics, and politicians are critical, but beneath the politics, there are the ideas and the views, and it's important that we have that vibrant public space. And I want to commend Luke on playing, on sort of pushing one aspect of that. I mean, there's one party in Barbados that has a lunchtime lecture every Friday. You know, every Friday there's a lecture. They invite people from different parts, and you go there, you listen to the lecture, you have your lunch, and you move on, and the speakers come from all aspects of life. So again, that's quite important, I think, in having that vibrant public space so that we have ideas contending. Thank you.
For the virtual audience, the question is relating to the electric car and the facilities available in Barbados for the charging of electric cars to correspond with the policy of having no duty and so forth on the importation of these cars. For repairs as well.
Yeah, so I'm not an agent for electric cars, but so that's often one of the challenges. You know, if you're going to build a new product, then you need the whole infrastructure. So there's a gas station everywhere if you run out of gas, and so on. So what has made a big difference in Barbados, I think, with electric cars is that there is a car dealership that does only electric cars. Okay, so it repairs, the servicing, the support. And when you buy the car, they will install something at your house that you can charge. So I don't rely on the public network. I treat my car like my phone. So I charge at home. But there's a growing public network of, it's not adequate, but it's growing. But the difference in price of gas is amazing. Huh? It's certainly. So the Jeep that I drive is sort of equivalent to like a RAV4. I would pay about, it would cost at least $200 a week to fill that up with gas. And my light bill is about $200 more a month from using that vehicle. Okay, so what I pay with the electricity is what I would pay for one fill up. And my wife drives a Nissan Leaf, which would be about $150 for that equivalent hatchback to fill up per week. And we pay about $50 more a month in electricity because of that. So it certainly makes a big difference. And then one of the big differences is, and I didn't realize that when I got involved, but the technology is very different. So in terms of servicing the vehicle, your costs are a lot lower because there's no oil to change. A lot of those parts. And there's been a massive investment in terms of the public buses in Barbados being electric. And that's been one of their big savings in terms of the maintenance, because it is quite a different technology. But the limitations in the public network of charging but it's really designed that you charge at home because you can't charge quickly in public. So it's not like you go to a gas station and you get filled up in 5 minutes. Typically it takes about 4 hours to charge. And if you do a fast charge, which is about an hour, you're not advised to do that. But it's really designed that you have a mechanism that you can charge at home. All right, so the Nissan Leaf, the battery is supposed to give you at least 10 years. So I'm 6 years into the Leaf. The last cost of a replacement battery, well, a replacement battery of the size I have, the last cost was about 5,000 US. But I guess when I change, I will go to the next level battery, which would cost about 10,000 US.
Thank you so much, Professor Robinson. I see a lot of interest being generated around electric cars. And, I see my parents in the audience, and they always tell us that saying thank you is not simply an issue of good manners, but it is also good spirituality. And tonight, I cannot finish our discussion, our lecture, without saying thank you to Professor Robinson for sharing his rich insight with us and for presenting the findings of his survey done. I want us to give him a round of applause. I appreciate. I think that one would be to be continued. So, thank you very much, Professor Robinson. Thank you very much, Luke, for dedicating time to this study. I know if it's one thing, when you're asked to, or when you're interested in a topic or find a topic of relevance, you delve yourself into finding out what are some of the root issues so that we can have the best solutions possible, and I really commend you for that. Hopefully one day I would be able to immerse myself in a topic like you do. I also want to thank ITFX and SVG TV for ensuring that we had a virtual audience tonight. I think that the theme of public education came through very strongly in terms of the comments and feedback tonight, and we must be able to ensure that persons aren't limited to come into one venue for such a session, but that they're able to access it in many different realms. So thank you so much to ITFX, to SVG TV, and to our virtual audience. And of course, I cannot thank you enough for being here, braving the weather. I know it's probably raining outside, so I'm going to say now I trust that you get home safely. Thank you so much for coming, because your voices, and as Mr. James said, we don't want to just have the voice being recorded. We want the voice to be included in the discussion going forward and into the solutions that we find. So I hope that we all find a way to share some of the insight that we learned in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, and so forth, so that more persons can be enriched and really start to think along development lines. Thank you so much, everyone, and I trust that you get home safely. I really appreciated your contributions tonight, and we look forward to the next lecture.